I'd like to introduce Karen. This is Karen Stevens, a former colleague of ours, a former librarian here at Billings Public Library when it was formerly Billings Library, and a ghost hunter throughout Montana and the world for the last, how many years? 20-some years. So without further ado, please welcome Karen Stevens.
Well, thank you, Barb, and I'd like to second her welcome. I think you got here just at the incoming storm, and I hope we'll all make it home safely before anything really bad hits. I did see a fairly large branch down that's coming down 29th Street, so looks like it could be an interesting event. Anyway, this is the 21st presentation of Haunted Billings. I do have several new hauntings to tell you about. And at the end of the program, we're going to have time for questions and answers. And I hope you brought lots of questions, and I hope I have some answers. For those of you who haven't been here before and don't know me, being a ghost hunter may be an odd occupation or avocation for a librarian, but I couldn't help it. I was born and brought up in a haunted house in Minneapolis. Now, we didn't know the place was haunted when my folks bought it, but it was only a couple of weeks after we moved in when we realized we were sharing the house with something we couldn't see. I was 7 years old at the time, my sister was 5, and my dad went to a great deal of trouble to build a playroom down the basement for us. And that playroom was not a comfortable place to be. It was okay for about the first 15 minutes, but after that, we felt like somebody was staring at us. And somehow we knew it was a man, and he didn't want us down there. We were invading what he regarded as his space. Well, much later we found out that the previous owner had died, and he had been a man who liked to do some woodworking down there. And of course he didn't want little children down where he was using tools. We didn't know that at the time, just that we didn't like being down there. So we run up and tell Mom, there's a man in the basement. And of course, nobody saw anything, but she believed me because she had an experience of her own when her brother died. She was mourning him because he was her favorite brother. And one day she was ironing and she looked up and there he was standing, leaning against the doorway with his arms crossed and smiling at her. And then she felt that he had come back to tell her he was okay, not to worry about him. So she believed me, but my dad did not. He was a scientist, one of these men who only believed something if he saw it, which is fine in a scientist. But he had a little trouble explaining the footsteps coming up the stairs at night. And when he would open the door to the basement, there was nothing there. Well, one night we were all at the table, and I looked up and saw the handle to the door to the basement turning round and round, and all of us were just riveted. And Dad reached over and grabbed that doorknob while it was turning and yanked the door open. And you know what he saw? Nothing. A cold, dark, empty staircase. Well, he never told us we were imagining things after that. But he never quite agreed that it was a ghost. Being a scientist, he was honest enough to say it was an unexplained event. And he didn't try to just ignore it. Well, I've been interested in ghosts ever since, because that was something unexplained. I wanted to know why and how these things happen. I've had a lot of experiences since then, and I have a lot of theories about why they happen, but they may be right or wrong. And it's been a great journey, a lot of fun on the way. And I know many of you have had experiences also. Some of you even have investigated places. And I'll tell you about some of the places here in Billings that are open to the public. Many of them welcome questions about their ghosts. So you can take reporters in, and if you're discreet and don't bother other customers, they probably won't mind if you just wander around and maybe ask a few questions into your recorder, because you never know what you're going to get. The place that really got me started on doing my ghost tours, which we retired from the last year, was the Western Heritage Center. The library had assigned me to do a Halloween program. And of course, I was calling all around to try to find out if somebody had a ghost. And Western Heritage Center was the only place that would admit that they had a ghost. And I went over there and talked to them. And boy, did they have a ghost. They had quite a few ghosts. The Western Heritage Center was built by the Billings family in 1901, as a gift to the city of Billings. And that was our first public library. And it's had quite a history over the years. One of the ghosts is thought to be Parley Billings himself, after whom our former library was named. He was the son of Frederick Billings, who was the president of the railroad and built the building. Well, Parley was sent west to learn his father's business, but also because he was getting into a bad crowd back in Vermont, and they wanted to send him away from that group of young men. Well, he was a very charming young man, a handsome man, and he soon became an expert poker player. And every time the cowboys came into town, he would play poker with them, and he almost always won. But he was so charming, they kind of forgave him for that. So Parley has been seen at the library, but not very often. Once they had an exhibit of memorabilia that belonged to him and his father, and men in the early 1900s frock coats were seen standing in front of it, and they think it was Parley and his father. But the main ghost at the library is a man in a checked shirt. He sits in the basement in this area. Those furnishings came from an old hotel where people stayed for a long time, resident hotel. And it's thought that he probably lived in that hotel, and he was familiar with those armchairs. He's been seen by many people, visitors as well as the staff, both when the building is closed and when it's open. And there you have a pretty good chance of catching something on audio if you take a recorder in there. He said to wear a check shirt, and he never pays any attention to people. He may just be one of those ghosts that really has no personality attached to it. He's just an energy imprint. So you may or may not get anything except a feeling of a presence. But it's a great place to experiment with your equipment. Another place that has recently admitted that they're haunted was the Babcock Theater. This was built in the early 1900s by Mr. Babcock, who was an early business leader in Billings. And it's been known to be haunted for a long time. The main ghost there is a lady who is seen in the balcony. Now this is the balcony as it originally was, with all of its Art Nouveau decorations. Of course, it's been modernized since then. that she is seen in the balcony moving along the row and then disappears. I talked to one lady who was a teenager in the 1950s, and she'd go there for the Saturday matinees. And as the audience was filing out one day, she happened to look up in the balcony, and here's this lady in a long gown, just moving along the balcony, floating, she said. And as she watched, the lady disappeared. Well, there's a legend about a lady who has thrown herself over the balcony. There is no written account of anything like that happening, no tragedy at all. However, when I was with the Montana Paranormal Research Society and we were investigating the building, we found that the stairway coming down from the top of the building and down to that balcony railing was uneven. The stairs tipped slightly forward, and the balcony railing was very low. It's only about knee high. My theory is that possibly a woman in a long dress was coming down those stairs, may have caught her heel in the hem of her gown and tripped. She may or may not have gone over that railing, or she may have stumbled and grabbed the railing and saved herself, but it's reasonable to believe that there had been an almost tragedy on those stairs. And I talked that over with the current owners, and they agreed that balcony is way too low for safety. So if you're attending an event there and you're coming down those stairs, please be very careful if you're wearing a long gown. You really don't want to go over that balcony. This is another very haunted place. We've had many things happen there on investigations. Lowe's Camp Hall at Rocky Mountain College is another building that's usually open. You can go in there with recorders or a camera. It's also used for classes, so you have to be careful not to interfere with any of the classes. The auditorium seems to be the most haunted place. We were doing an investigation there one night, and we heard footsteps on the stairway that leads up to the stage. We could see nothing, but all of a sudden, the lights that were on the stage came up glowing red and stayed on for about 2 minutes and then went down again. Then we heard the footsteps running down the stairway. Well, in the first place, it's impossible for the bulbs to glow red, according to an electrician we got in the next day. And also, there was nobody there who could have thrown those switches. Also, unfortunately, the ghost had waited until we had already wrapped up the investigation and stowed our cameras away, so we did not catch anything, either on camera or audio, but there were 6 witnesses. And that is one of the more unexplained events that's happened there. The ghost is supposed to be that of Mr. Lowe's camp. He was an early business owner. He was very interested in education and actually helped bail out Rocky when they got into financial difficulties in the 1920s. And he is thought to, number one, have killed his wife in the building, then committed suicide in the building, and obviously, since the building was built 5 years after he died, it's a little difficult for him to murder a wife he never had in the building, and also to have committed suicide in the building because he died of kidney disease in the hospital. However, the facts are seldom allowed to get in the way of a good story, so the legend persists. Now, you may experience things there like the doors, which are very heavy oak and about 3 inches thick, opening by themselves. I've experienced that myself. And who knows what you may catch in the building, so it's worth paying a visit there. The DoubleTree, actually known as the Sheraton at the time, is the scene of a haunting by this young lady, Olive Dewey Warren Westfield McDaniels. She was an early day madam. She was a very beautiful woman. She had good business sense, and she had a famous brothel called the Lucky Diamond. And you may know that the old Sheraton had a restaurant called the Lucky Diamond in her honor. Well, why does she haunt the Sheraton? Her brothel was several blocks away. Well, the fact is that there was a stable on the site of the Sheraton back in the early 1900s, and she boarded her horse there. And she used to go over every day and mount her horse and ride up and down the street exercising. So it's thought that that's why she haunts the place. Well, she has been seen by a number of people. She never appears to women, only gentlemen. And she likes handsome young men. Just because she's dead doesn't mean she can't look. Young security guards have experienced things like going up in the elevator all by themselves, and all of a sudden the elevator will fill with perfume. And one young man felt a tug at his jacket sleeve, and there was nobody there, but he heard a woman's laugh almost in his ear. Well, he knew it was Ollie, and it didn't bother him because he had grown up in a haunted house. So he just said, "Hi, Ollie, how you doing?" And then the scent faded away. Now, you may not be that lucky. There was a husband and wife radio team, announcing team up on the, I think it was 20th floor. This was a locked floor. One day, Sunday morning, they were on the air, and the wife of the radio announcer looked out into the hallway and saw a woman in a long green velvet dress, very old-fashioned, with her hair upswept like that, walking past their doorway. And the woman looked in and smiled at the lady announcer. And she was kind of puzzled, so when there was a break in the program, she said to her husband, "Is there a costume party going on today?" And he said, "Well, not to my knowledge." So she told him what she'd seen, and they both got up and went up and down the hall. The doors are all locked. There's nobody there. Well, they told me the story, and I said, "Did you know that Ollie Warren used to wear a green velvet riding habit when she exercised her horse?" And you could just see the woman's face drain when she realized who she had seen. But Ollie is a friendly ghost. She's regarded as a protecting ghost, as many ghosts are. And she does make her presence known often enough to keep the legend alive, and maybe if you're a handsome young gentleman, you'd be lucky. Now, of course, you've all heard of the Lost Mansion. You may have even gone in there for a tour. I know they're having some haunted tours the next few weekends. There have been many, many things experienced there. The only reason I haven't written about it in the book is because for over 25 years, they would not give me permission to do so. They did not want to be known as a haunted building. Finally, since other buildings were opening up and admitting their stories, they decided that they would too. And of course, everybody loves to go on ghost tours and haunted mansions. Now, one of the ghosts that haunts there is the little girl ghost Virginia Moss. She died at the age of 5 of diphtheria. And she has been seen many times. I talked to a young woman who saw her on one of their mystery weekends when they were going up the stairway to the 3rd floor. And the little girl was seen peeking around the corner at them, and she was wearing kind of a frilly old-fashioned dress. Well, the woman who saw her knew this was not an ordinary person. It wasn't somebody playing a role. So when they got back down, she talked to the organizers of the program, and they showed her a photograph of Virginia wearing that very same dress. Virginia likes to play tricks on people. There was one investigation I was on where I was up in the ballroom, which is full of stuff. It's not used for anything but storage normally. And the guys were up in the attic, and I was just walking around thinking what fun this must have been to have this great big empty ballroom back in the 1900s, and the kids could play there on those rainy days. And I said aloud, not knowing if anybody was listening or if I was talking to empty air, gee, this would have been a wonderful place to play on a rainy day. Did you ever come up here and roller skate or play basketball with a little hoop over there? Or did you come up with your brothers or sisters? Oh, I thought nothing of it. I didn't feel anything or sense anything. But when I played that audio tape back, when I said, did you come up here with your brothers or sisters or yourself? This little girl's voice says very clearly, me. There wasn't anybody up there that could have said that I could see anyway. So another experience one of our team leaders had, it was a quiet night, we were investigating, nothing was happening. And he came down the main stairway, and he said in a rather exasperated manner, well, where are all the ghosts tonight? Nothing's happening. Where are they? And when he played that audio back, a male voice said, right beside you. He said he was glad he hadn't heard that lie, or he might have run down the rest of the stairs. So if you take a tour and you have your cell phone or record or bring the recorder along, kind of lag behind the group a little bit and see if you can get anything on your recording. You have a reasonably good chance there. Now, of course, the Yellowstone Art Museum, they are also having a haunted tour. I'm not sure what night it's going to be, but it always sells out. This was a former jail that was built around 1909 on the site of an even earlier jail. And there are still some of the cells down the basement. They look similar to this picture which was taken in the 50s. And that's where a lot of the activity is. They used to hold prisoners down there. And apparently some of those prisoners are still hanging around, quite literally in one case. There was one legal execution in the building back in 1918. He was a man named Juan Gula. He was a sugar beet worker, and he was convicted of the murder of a policeman back in December of 1917. It happened at a bar on First Avenue South, or not First Avenue, Minnesota Avenue. And he was waving a gun around, threatening the patrons. The bartender called the police, and they sent over Enos Nelson, saying, you better go over there, it looks like there's an armed man, and he's starting trouble. Well, Nelson had barely set foot in the door when he was shot and killed. So, Guella was convicted and sentenced and hanged in the stairway on the second floor in April of 1918. Apparently, he still haunts that area. The stairway has since been destroyed, but on the tour, you can go up to that area, and sometimes you will feel a choking sensation. Even people who know nothing about the story of the haunting or the legend will feel choking. And we've investigated that building also, and we've gotten some very interesting replies to questions in Spanish, because Juan Guella spoke Spanish. Apparently, he's fairly happy where he is, and he does regret the murder of the policeman. So you might want to take that tour. If you go down the basement, they'll take you back to an area where he was held before his execution. And there have been other things that happened down in the basement too. It's a very interesting tour. So if you want to go, give them a call, find out if and when they're going to have a tour this year, because they will sell out. Now, this is one of the places that has not admitted they were haunted until this year. I've known that it was, but I always respect the businesses that do not want it known. Lincoln High School was built in the, I think around 1894. And there were a lot of tunnels that connected the building with other buildings. You've probably heard of the old mysterious tunnels that ran from the steam or hot water heating plant, which was right next door to the Lincoln School, ran through their basement and across the street and spread out across part of the city. It actually connected 31 buildings. There's no way the public can access that area down there. The tunnels have been blocked off over time, they've collapsed, but right under the school they still exist. And I got a photo of one of them. It's hard to make out, but you can see a figure in the background. That is one of the maintenance men, and that is what the tunnels look like. They hold the hot water heating plants, pipes, and they go in maze around the basement. And it's not a concrete floor, and the floor is kind of worn down sandstone, and it dips and swoops and is uneven, and it's actually dangerous, very difficult to get around down there. That's why they don't allow the public down there, unfortunately, but it's just a matter of liability. But I was down there, and the team had gone ahead of me, and they were listening to our guide, and I kind of lagged behind, and I spoke into my recorder, and I said, "Why are you here?" Because the story is that a man in a 1900s frock coat and top hat has been seen in the upper floors of the school. He doesn't seem very friendly, and he sometimes taps people on the shoulder. Well, I asked, "Why are you here?" And when I played that back later, very faintly I could hear a man's voice say, "I live here." Well, the first superintendent of the school was a very sadistic man. He used to take students down into that basement and beat them until their screams could be heard outside the school. Well, eventually he was removed by the parents' request. The school board agreed. But apparently some of that atmosphere lingers down in the basement, because there are parts of that that are very discomforting if you're sensitive. And there is a student lounge down there that used to be the teacher's lounge, but nobody uses it anymore. So that is a very interesting place. I wish they would be able to open it to the public for tours, but they'd have to limit them to about 10 people at a time, and any person who goes down there would probably have to be very used to going up and down and sideways and places that are kind of hard to scramble into. This is another building that we used to talk about on our tour, but has not been publicly owned to be haunted. This is the old arcade bar. Some of you probably have good memories of the arcade. It was Billings' worst dive, and it's considered an adventure to go over there and get a few drinks and just kind of experience the atmosphere. Well, this was originally built by the two Lee brothers. They were Chinese. This building is the only one remaining of Chinatown. We had about 400 Chinese in Billings from about 1890s to the 1920s. And the Lees were the leaders. This was built as a Chinese grocery, And then the rooms on the top were built to be rooms they rented out to the railroad crews that stopped overnight. Eventually, the top floor became a brothel. Well, the Lee brothers had died by 1920s, and of course, the building changed hands many times. Eventually, a man bought it, and it became the arcade bar, with Billings' worst died. The man's name was Pearly Gates. Probably for good reason, because if you spend a night living there, you had a pretty good chance of walking through those little pearly gates by morning. There were knifings and shootings and people being brutally beaten up. And if you went drinking there, you put your back against a wall. There were no places to sit down. And you just went with a friend and you looked out for one another because it was very dangerous. I can tell you the police hated to go over there because they knew it was just nothing but trouble. Well, when Mr. Gates died, the city bought it. It's a historic building. I'm very glad it was saved, and it is still haunted. The subway that used to be on the first floor, the employees said they had a lot of things happen. You'd hear men's conversation at night after they closed. Things got moved around. And it's still going on. So nothing stops a good haunting unless the building is raised to the wall. And I think that may be what happened with the Rex. Unfortunately, my favorite haunt. We'll find out when they open again at the end of the month. Now, the Billings Depot has a good story about a railroad man, a conductor who was shot and killed by a cowboy. There is no written report on anything like that happened, but there is a report that a man in old-fashioned railroad uniform was seen walking past the motion picture crew when they were filming Far and Away there in the early 90s. I was on the board of the depot for a couple of years, and we investigated the building. We did have some odd things happen. We were wrapping up an investigation, and we had put a ball out in the middle of that floor, because one of the stories is there's a child ghost who haunts the place. Well, when we came back from the baggage room, that ball had been moved all the way to the other end of that long room and was under a bench. Of course, we'd taken down our cameras. The ghost seemed to like waiting until we're all wrapped up and there's nothing that we have for evidence except seeing that the ball had been moved. Yeah, I wouldn't say it's a terribly active building, but you may very well have an experience if you're there, maybe for a wedding setup or, one of the other functions that happens there. Now, the Blue Rancher Lodge is one of my favorites. It's where we started our ghost tours. It is haunted by the spirit of the original owner. She has been seen many times. She used to play jokes on us. There was a particular room that she liked to be in, and we'd take our tours up there, and we'd open the door with a key and let the tour in. But one night, we couldn't make the door open. The key wouldn't work. Finally, one of the desk clerks had to come up and go through another room with a connecting door and get in that way, and she found the door to the room we wanted to get in had the bolt shot from the inside, and there was nobody there. Well, after that, we decided that maybe the ghost didn't want to be disturbed that night. So from then on, we would knock on the door and we would say, Annabelle, this is us again, may we come in? And then we'd turn the key and always it would open. So courtesy pays. Just because a person is out of their body doesn't mean they don't like to be treated like a living person, courteously. Which is why I really don't care to watch these ghost programs where they're trying to use all sorts of forcible methods to get activity started. That seems to turn off a lot of the activity. This is the new Rancher lobby. I stayed one night, in fact, it was shortly after Halloween a couple of years ago, in the haunted home, and we got some odd rustling sounds on the audio. It sounded like somebody wearing old-fashioned taffeta skirts from the 1950s, just moving around the room all night. But I couldn't rule out noises being picked up from outside, because that microphone was very sensitive, and there really were people out in the parking lot all night coming and going. So I can't say that is particularly evidential, but it's still a very active building, and if you want to make a haunted room, you've got to reserve it in advance. Because around Halloween, people come from all over to try to get that one. This is another building that has just recently admitted to a haunting. The Oxford Antiques used to be the Oxford Hotel. It was built in the early 1900s. And in 1922, a man from Wyoming, who was very depressed and ill, shot himself in a room up on the second floor. Well, I had an encounter with him or somebody there about 20 years ago. I knew nothing about the haunting at the time, but I was walking up the stairs to the second floor. The antiques place is very interesting, and their collection extends to the second floor. You can see the hallway in the very back part of that bottom photo, or the stairway. If you go up there, there's a landing, and that's where I wasn't looking upward. I was watching where my feet were going, and all of a sudden I felt as if there was somebody coming down the stairs from the upper floor, and I stopped and moved over so the person could pass me, except there was nobody there. And whoever it was stopped a couple stairs above me and looked at me, or at least I felt it did, and he seemed to be male, and he wasn't hostile or anything, he was just curious. Well, after a couple seconds, it was all gone, and I continued up to the second floor. Nothing more happened, so I went down, and just before I left, I said to the owners, you know, you have a ghost on the second floor. And they said, oh yeah, he doesn't bother anything. And I said, that's the impression I got, that he likes to come down to that landing and just look out over the first floor and watch you walk all the business. You have a lot of antiques that date back to the early 1900s, and that's what he's attracted to. So not only is it a fascinating place to look at because of the antiques, make sure you go up those stairs to the second floor. And if you have a recorder, I didn't have one that day, see if you can pick up anything. Just talk to them and say, is there anyone here? You might be lucky. Now, of course, this is one of the most haunted places in the nation. It's also a very sad place. If you have ever been out there, you'll know that there are many stories about the hauntings at the Little Bighorn battlefield, both Native American and Army. They've been seen by visitors, they've been seen by park rangers, and Native Americans as well. There was a woman who was sitting on a bench near the cemetery, the National Cemetery, and she was just kind of meditating. Beautiful fall day, and all of a sudden she looked up, and a man in an old Army uniform was staggering by in front of her, and she said he was all bloody, and his face looked just tormented. And as he passed, he turned and looked at her, and she said his eyes were like looking into hell, what he'd gone through. So be very respectful if you go into places like this. These are people who fought hard on both sides and went through some terrible times, and the spirits still linger. during the reenactment of the battle. Reenactors have heard the sound of a bugle at 3 o'clock in the morning. It's playing recall. The man who heard it was an active duty Army man. And I asked him, what was it playing? He said, recall. And he said it sounded differently because it was played on a different kind of trumpet than we have nowadays. And the Indians left reports that the bugler kept playing something, of course they didn't recognize the tune, kept playing something over and over and over and over again until he was finally shot down. So apparently the echoes of that can still be heard by people who are sensitive. If you want to practice using your sensitivity, the battlefield is a very good place to practice. Oh, good. We have lots of time for questions and answers. I hope you brought lots of personal experiences with you to share. And I'll try to get in as many as we can in the next 20 minutes to half an hour or so. Who wants to start?
When you were investigating the arcade,
Mm-hmm.
did you find any stories of Tong and their murders?
Tom and the murders?
Tong, Chinese?
Oh, the Tongs. Only in the newspaper. The newspaper had a story about the arcade bar, the L&L building, as it's known now. And both of the Lee brothers were members of one of the two Tong, which are Chinese clubs in a way. A lot of times they're associated with criminal activity. Apparently the two Tongs would kill each other like the mafia does if they have disagreements. But I have not found anything about that except what I read in that section of the newspaper a few weeks ago. I certainly don't doubt that it happened, and maybe they were some of the men who still haunt the place. When it was empty after Mr. Gates died, the media was brought in to try to find out who haunted the place. She couldn't even get started because all of a sudden all the lights in the building went out and things started to be thrown. And so they just gave up on that and got out of the building. Anyone else have some experiences? Yes, back there?
Me?
Yeah.
Well, I used to live in a haunted house on Lewis Ave, and it was a child, and I always wanted to find out what happened, who this child was, but I didn't own the house, so I couldn't. How do you research something like that to figure out what happened or who it might have been?
The question is, how do you research a haunting in a house that you live in? Did you actually see the ghost or just sense it?
No, I saw it several times.
Okay, what
It was
type
just,
of clothing was it wearing?
it was always like it were running in front of me or sitting next to me on the couch. So if I ever looked at it, I mean, it was like gone. So I don't know. I did find in my basement buried in the what do you call those? It's the the crawl space. So there was a piece of fabric sticking out of it, so I pulled it out, and it was like a butterfly collar shirt, small. It looked like there was blood on it.
Mm.
So, and then I had found a knife, like a big knife, like under this giant slab next to my house. So, I mean, I always wondered if like something. Someone told me to call the cops, and I'm not telling the cops. I found a bloody knife, and there's a ghost in my house. So.
Well, I know there's a house in the 400 block of Burlington that has a story of a child who may or may not have been murdered, but you say your house was on
It was
Lewis.
on the list.
If you had seen the ghost clearly, so you could get an idea of the period of the clothing it was wearing, that would help to date it. Otherwise, you can go to a property title search through the city directories are the easiest to use. Make a list of the people who lived there at different times. Then you have to go painstakingly through a search of the Gazette. And fortunately, all of the Gazette is online now for searching all the way back to the early 1900s. So if there was a murder, you might be able to find it that way, but it would be very painstaking research. And still you may find nothing if it was covered up. I find it helps to treat your house ghost as a guest. After all, he or she may have lived in the house longer than you have, and still regarded as their own. I have a female ghost in the house in which I am currently living. I think she's the wife of one of the early owners. The house is about 70 years old. She loves to bake. Sometimes I would come home and the whole house smelled like baking Christmas cookies. It only happens around the holidays. And other times, I'd walk in and it smelled like roasting turkey, and it was so real, I would actually go over to the oven to make sure I hadn't put a turkey in and forgotten it. Of course, there's nothing there, and the oven is cold and empty. The smells were great, but there was never anything real left for me. But there was one time, I had just found out that I had to have shoulder surgery, and I was feeling very sorry for myself, so I sat down at the dining room table and I was just kind of moping, and all of a sudden I smelled chocolate chip cookies. Now this was in March, and this was not the usual Christmas type cookies. This were chocolate chip cookies. And I felt someone come up and stand beside me, and it was just like she was putting a plate of cookies in front of me and a glass of milk and saying, now, half a cookie and a glass of milk and everything will be better. Well, of course, there was no cookie there, no glass of milk, but I turned and I thanked her for the concern that she had shown. And she's just like having a friend who is rarely seen or sensed, but I feel she's kind of protective and a guardian of the house. So you can learn to get along with your ghosts. My neighbor said the wife of the earliest owner loved to bake and would spend the 2 weeks leading up to the holidays just baking up a storm. So that's why I think she's probably my house ghost. Any questions or comments? Yes, back there.
So, a few years ago, I was teaching in Pryor at Honeycomb High School, and one night I stayed late and was correcting papers, and I could hear somebody walking around. This was after dark, it was in the fall, and so I went to go check, see if it was one of the kids snuck in playing a joke on me, and whoever was there was holding the door, and it was as if it was locked, and I had to wrestle it to yank it open. And when I went through it, I could hear slow footsteps going towards the exit, and there's nobody in the hallway. And I was like, okay, these papers will wait till tomorrow.
The gentleman said he was a teacher out at Pryor School, and he was marking papers alone one night and heard footsteps, went to investigate. And the door was being held partly open, and he tried to close it and it wouldn't let him. And then he heard footsteps walking down the hallway, and he decided the papers would wait until the next day. Good decision. Yes?
So I was staying at Chico. Have you ever stayed at Chico?
Oh, many times.
Okay. Anyway, we got a room, a surprise, and ended up we found out after we'd been there that it was one of the haunted hallway rooms. It was room 349.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was super hot up on that third floor. So we had our window open, and we were trying to just cool it off. So we had the door open, but we kept hearing these footsteps back and forth. And we kept looking, and there was nobody there. And I told my daughter, make sure you shut the door if you actually see somebody. But there was nobody there, and these footsteps, just back and forth, back and forth. and didn't think much of it. And then the next morning, we heard this woman at the front desk saying, and she was in room 350. She said she kept opening the door and would, just like somebody was there, she could hear something and she would open it and nobody was there. And she said that Billings did that all night long. Well, anyway, I lost a pair of sunglasses. I know I had them in there. And I'm just, have you ever experienced where they actually could take something and just remove it?
Oh, yes.
Okay, because I just think there's a ghost walking around with some sunglasses.
Percy used to sit there and just stare out at the mountains. She had run the resort since it was founded back in the early 1900s, and finally she started to have a mental breakdown. She couldn't stand the stress of trying to keep it going through the depression, and she would sit in her rocking chair in 349 and just stare out at the mountains. Finally, she had to take her to Warm Springs, and she died there, but she has never left. She's regarded as a protective ghost. One story is that she appeared in her old-time clothing in a full restaurant, and nobody thought anything of it. They just thought she was a guest with kind of an outdated sense of clothing until she disappeared in front of their eyes. Well, she is a protective ghost. There were some boys who were trying to dive from a roof into the hot spring, and she didn't like that. So she appeared on that roof and scared them so badly that they stopped doing that. So if you can stay at Chico and get a room in the main lodge, you can have knocks on the door in the middle of the night, you can hear footsteps going up and down, you can feel a sense of presence, and yes, ghosts do move things. I find that things are moved all the time in my house, and I attribute it to just being old, but some of the things are gone, and I'll say, where is that? And turn around and it's there again. So maybe it's just age, maybe it's the ghost having a sense of humor. I prefer to believe it's a ghost having a sense of humor. If any of you have not been to the old prison in your lodge, that's a great place to have experiences. This gentleman was saying that he felt he was being watched the whole time he was taking his solo tour. Didn't catch anything, but just the sense of presence, which is probably the most common thing you'll feel in a haunted place, is just a sense of presence. The prison is noted for the smell of burning wood from when the theater was burned down in the 70s. It's acrid smoke. It smells just like the fire was yesterday, and yet it was 50 years ago. Also, people report being pushed, having voices say rude things in their ear. I mean, they weren't in prison because they were nice guys. It's really fun to go through the prison as long as you realize that these guys really are capable of not being very nice to visitors. I wouldn't say it's dangerous, but just be on your lookout. We've had investigations there, and I've gotten a few small things like filming the door to the death penalty area open by itself in the middle of the night. There's no wind, no reason for it. Footsteps, of course, in the cell block. You can hear the cell doors slamming when they're all open and locked. So you can catch a lot of stuff there. But again, be respectful. If somebody gets aggressive, they just don't respond to that. Believe me, those guys could be a lot more aggressive than any of us could. So try being courteous, and you probably have a better chance of catching something. There are a couple types of ghosts. Some seem to have an actual intelligence with the apparition. Some seem to be nothing but residual energy, which is like watching a movie. The activity goes on and on. It's usually repetitious. There's no intellect associated with that type of haunting. They They will not respond to a watcher, they will not respond to a ghost hunter any more than you could question Clark Gable on the movie screen. It's just an image, and there's nothing you can do about that type of ghost. Those energies do wear off over time. They fade, they become very pale. Eventually, there will be nothing left of that energy. But if you have an intellect attached to that haunting, then you've got an actual spirit, which may or may not just be a visitor coming and going. A lot of times we have family members who drop in from time to time just to make sure we're doing okay. Usually nothing to worry about, depending on your family, of course. Sometimes it's people who lived there before. I have heard a couple stories about ghosts who were very aggressive to people moving into their house. They were very attached to the house and they really resented that it was sold. And sometimes you can come to an accommodation with those spirits and say, look, I know you loved your house. I love it too. I will do my best to keep it up and keep it beautiful. And you have no reason to worry about it. And so, sometimes you can come to an accommodation that way. There's no need to call in an exorcist or, an aggressive ghost hunter. Just talk to it. See what kind of response you get. A lot of times, once they know that you're going to take care of their place, they're fine with it. I had a gentleman at an earlier program told me that he inherited a house from his grandmother. It was one of the historic houses near downtown. And he would come home from work sometimes and he would see his grandmother sitting in the rocking chair out on the front porch. And he would smile at her and she would wave at him and then she was gone. And that's all it was. But he said he really loved to see his grandma. And he knew that she was still there. She was happy and he was happy. So there's really no need to fear spirits. In 50-some years of ghost hunting and going over a haunted house, I've only twice run into a, say, difficult spirit. And looking back on those occasions, I think mainly we didn't understand why the ghost was haunting. He had a very good reason to haunt. And we assumed he was evil. He was just trying to protect his building. Still, he did try to burn the place down and push people down stairways. So he was up to any method to get us out of that place. Finally, the place was sold. It was gutted to the walls. There is no longer a haunting. There is just a sense of nothingness in that building anymore. It's just a big void.
Do you think you can ask ghosts to leave?
Yes,
Okay, and they will.
not necessarily. You can't force a ghost to leave.
But they might leave if
You can ask if you give them enough reason. If it's somebody who is staying because they're concerned about how you're going to treat the house, maybe they were very house proud, as they say, you can say, you can go on, that we're going to take very good care of your house, and if you want to come back from time to time to look, you'd be welcome, but there's a better place waiting for you, and all you have to do is look for it. And many times that's enough to break the concentration or the focus of the ghost on the house and release it to go. On other occasions, they won't go. They just, for reasons of their own, they want to stay. But you can certainly set limits to the activities you will allow. I've known people who said, leave the pets alone, leave the kids alone, no standing over them when they're asleep, no coming into the bathroom when somebody is in there. And usually that would work. Now if you get a really nasty spirit, that's a whole different ball of wax. Then you might want to call in somebody who has some experience in dealing with that, maybe a minister or a psychic who can genuinely contact them. But a reasonable request for them to leave often does work. And try that first. Yes?
I just have a question. Do you think, we talked a lot about ghosts like haunting certain buildings that they were attached to. Does each ghost or spirit have to be attached to an object or a person or a house, or can they just roam?
They always have a reason for being there. It might not be a reason that we would think sensible. For instance, the old library that used to be in this courtyard was very haunted. It was haunted by a variety of people. We don't know who they were, but they certainly had no reason to hang around a library for their lifetime. When the building was demolished, we formally invited them to move over to this one. And until this year, none of them took us up on it. But I heard from a just retired children's librarian that somebody in maintenance had an experience here now. And I haven't had a chance to talk to them yet. But they're very pleased that one of the ghosts took us up on our invitation. I do know that several of them moved over to the new Glacier. They have an increase in activity after the old building was torn down. Usually they're attached to an object. If you go to an antique store and you buy an old bed or a rocking chair, could be that Grandpa came along with his favorite chair. Well, the question is, can the ghost attach itself to a person and follow them? Yes, I've had reports of ghosts following people from house to house to house. Often it's a family member, a grandparent or something, but I will say that we have to be very careful when we're investigating a prison not to have something attached to us. And we would all gather around at the end and talk to whatever higher power we believed in and ask that we be protected and that no one would follow us home. We would tell the ghosts, you cannot leave this place, you cannot follow us home. Well, there was one occasion we forgot to do that, or I did, and a couple nights later I woke up in bed being strangled. I could feel a man's large hands around my throat, and I was just panicking, and I just threw myself up, and I said, get out of here, and it left. And it was not a dream, I had marks on my throat. And it was because one of those men had followed me home, and had forgotten to take the precaution of putting energy around me and keeping it away. So if you're going to investigate a place, particularly like the prison, be sure you ask for protection from whatever higher power you may believe in. It does help. More questions? Yes?
I just want to say, I went to Rocky, and all 4 years, I was the work study for the theater department, which is housed in the basement of this camp hall. And so, to corroborate your story, I have probably a dozen stories from the best friends I made down there.
So you went to Rocky for 4 years, and you were in Lowe's Camp Hall?
Yes, I was the work study for Lowe's Camp Hall.
Mm-hmm.
Basement.
And you had many experiences there.
Oh, yes.
Did you see anything?
Yes.
What did you see?
The first time I saw somebody, it was a shadow man, so no features, like no obvious clothing or face, and a man in a top hat. I was working in the shop down in the basement, and it was late at night, probably 11:30, and so it was key card access only at that point. And I heard the lights come on from the automatic light sensors in the bathroom. Click, click, and I was like, that's weird. And I heard one of the keys turning, and I was like, not many people have access to the keys. I have the student set. And so I look out, and there's this shadow man walking around. And so I would chase him down the hallway, like, what the heck is going on? The door slams. By the time I get the door open, he's gone.
That's interesting because one of the most haunted places in the basement of Lowe's Camp is the bathrooms.
Yep.
And Lily was just saying that she had been working late in the basement basement one night, and heard keys turning locks and doors opening, and looked and saw a man in a top hat, obviously turning the century, unless it was an actor in part wearing dress of that day. However, the former theatrical director there was closing up one night after a rehearsal for a performance, and all the actors had gone. And he went to the stage to turn off the lights. And he happened to look up the balcony, and there was this glowing green figure standing at the balcony looking down at him. And he had his hands on the switches, and he shut the lights out and left the stage so fast down those 3 or 4 wooden steps that aren't very stable that he hurt his leg and had to hobble back out to the main hall where his girlfriend was waiting for him. And she said, "What in the world is wrong with you?" And he said, he couldn't say anything. He just pointed, and his eyes just the biggest saucers, and she ran in there. Of course, by then it's gone. But Rose Camp Hall is very haunted. I think you could probably go in any time during the day when it's maybe not used as classes, and just wander around a bit. I have done some. You never know what you get. Just don't be surprised if you have a visitor in the bathroom. Burlington School, which we investigated, is very active. One of the things that have been reported by the neighbors across the street is a group of children in 1940s clothing out in the parking lot bouncing balls against the walls. And the kids are apparently calling to each other, but you can't hear any voices, but they hear the sound of the balls hitting the wall. Well, these balls are not real balls, so how does it create a sound? And when we did an investigation there one night, they were having a great deal of fun with us. We caught on camera one of the investigators walking along the hallway, and the shadows tiptoeing after her. And as soon as they knew they'd been seen, they would disappear. Or they would hold the door open, and you could just see somebody peeking around it. And when we went to see, they let go of the door, and they were gone. They were playing tricks on us all night. So we were down in the library taking a break and talking about what was going on and trying to figure out what it was, and using an obelisk, which you're probably familiar with. It's a little computer device that has a dictionary in it, and those supposedly can choose words to contact you. And all of a sudden it said, "Paranormal retards." And we just broke up. We had never heard anything so funny. And it just continued like that all night. They were just making fun of us, and we actually got to enjoy it. So any of the schools you go into, of course, many of them don't like it to be known that they're haunted, but I don't know of a school in Billings and it is not, and many churches are too. But again, they're pretty sensitive about letting that be known. So just use your common sense and train your senses if you want to. You don't have to. You can close yourself off to it. A lot of people will go in historic places, and part of the fun is just to see if you can sense anything. You can train yourself into being more receptive, or you can close it off if you want to. It's just a matter of willpower. So, are we, oh yes, we're getting close to time. Probably have time for one more question. Okay, yes.
So we both work at Lincoln Center.
Mm-hmm.
I'm up on the 3rd floor, she's on the 2nd floor.
Uh-huh.
We've never actually seen anything, but our custodian has seen the top hat guy several times.
Mm-hmm.
But here lately in the basement, they're hearing a little girl sing in the mornings.
Really?
And so I'm just curious if you know of anything else that's happening there.
No, aside from the man who said, "I live here," when I asked the question when we were investigating down there, I have not heard of a little girl singing. I have heard a little girl, or a whole group of kids way up in the attic who actually tried to trip one of the people from the school who were up there for some reason and felt somebody catching her ankle as she was going back down the stairs. And she got really mad and she just told them off. And it's never happened again. But maybe those kids are starting to roam around the school. I'm there often for night classes, so I've never had anything happen at that time. But you never know, I might get lucky one of these days.
Well, the third floor, especially at night, the third floor just has a weird vibe to it. It's, I don't know. And I don't know if maybe some of that's mental because we've heard stories. And so we're just wondering, you know, am I going to see anything? But there's, I don't know, there's just something funky. We've had students that have seen things that we can't see.
Well, my classes are usually there on the fourth floor, but I'll, next time I'm down there, I'll kind of pass through the third floor. I would say any place in the school is probably wide open for paranormal activity. I mean, there's no way to restrict it really. But I'm glad it's being acknowledged, because a lot of times that's all they want, they just want to be acknowledged. If you have a house ghost, just say, hello, I'm home. You know, treat it as if it were a friend. I try to do that with my house ghost. She never answers, of course. Once in a while, I'll smell those baking Christmas cookies, and I'm looking forward to have this season, if she happens to feel like doing that. I just wish she'd be able to. So with that, I think I will thank you all for coming, and we'll meet again next year, I hope. Take care going home, and stay safe tomorrow.